Joe, it's a pleasure to be here. And I am always learning, and I'm looking forward to learning from you and to hearing from all of our excited audio participants. So I know we will have lots of times questions,
hmm
but I also know that sometimes you don't think of that question until the next day. I'm going to suggest that we all connect on LinkedIn and continue the discussion tomorrow or the next day or the day after that. So, just in case you don't get to ask that question today, let's make sure we all sync up on LinkedIn. That's a good way to stay connected.
Yeah.
So, yeah, indeed. So I want to talk about science, and maybe I should say, first of all, what qualifies me to talk about science. And I guess the answer has to be that a long time ago, when I got my first college degree back in 1963, huh, huh, it was in chemistry. And not only that, I got a minor in biochemistry. And the reason why I got a minor was that the University of Kansas, which is where I was attending at the time, didn't have enough in the way of course offerings to provide a degree in biochemistry. They only had enough courses for a minor. So think how the world has changed since 1963. Because now, of course, biochemistry would even be too broad. There'd be too many courses for someone to get a degree in it. You'd have a subspecialty of biochemistry. And since then, of course, I've always stayed technical. I've been in various other scientific fields, but that beginning for me shaped how I think even now. So I hope I can provide some insight about scientific thinking. But really, my primary topic today is going to be babies. And I want to begin by saying not all babies are alike. I have a grandniece who was born with myasthenia gravis. That affects her muscle development. It definitely impacts everything she does. And that will be the case for her entire life. So, not all babies are alike. I want to apologize if I imply that. But babies, as a stereotypical group, are a good topic for us today because babies are scientists. And since we were all babies at one time, but some of us might not remember exactly what that thinking was like, maybe we need a little bit of a review. So some of us, I think, make the mistake in believing that scientific thinking is a process of steps. You do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. You develop an hypothesis. You test that hypothesis. You analyze the results. You haul out some heavy duty statistics. We have bought into that model thinking that it is a step by step process. So, my good friend and co author, Mary Lynn Mans, and I wrote what I think is still a pretty impactful book called More Fearless Change and Fearless Change. And in it, we had a pattern called Step by Step. We were trying to talk about the process of organizational change. And we thought the pattern step by step would carry the message that this is not something that happens overnight. It does take a series of small incremental changes. But over time, we became less happy with that name. And so we did, in our maintenance activities, change it. The new name is called Baby Steps. And the implication there is different, I hope, that change and scientific thinking both are not linear. Let's move forward down a path step by step. No, it's more like babies learning to walk. They don't suddenly wake up and say, I'm going to walk. Let me just try a step and then a second step and then a third step. No, it's a series of take a step, fall down, try to make it to the coffee table or the chair, fall down. Sometimes those babies are happy when they fall down, they laugh. Sometimes babies are unhappy, they cry. But I have never known a baby, and not that I've known all the babies in the world, but none of them that I've ever known have ever said, this is too hard for me. I give up. I guess I don't have what it takes. The babies I know and the babies I read about get up, take a little step, fall down. And whether they're happy about it or whether they cry, the next day they still get up. Now, there are a lot of people who talk about science, and that notion has really not been with us as Homo sapiens for a long time. In fact, the word science and scientific were not even used until the mid 1800s. There wasn't any training in any field of science. There were individual scientists, there were biologists, there were researchers, but the notion that there was a field defined by the word science has only been around since the mid to late 1800s. So it's not something that we're really that familiar with, or in our long history as humans, it's not something that we've really been using. Let's take a look at how they do that. Now, I've known a lot of babies. I've also known a lot of parents. And I don't think I've ever known any parents who said, I think we need to send our baby to school, but we want our baby to have the best. We want our baby to really learn how to walk. We want our baby to do the best job possible. We want our baby to be better, faster, cheaper. Now, I'm not saying there aren't any parents like that. And I'm not saying that there may be some parents who send their babies to walking school, but I've never met any. And as far as I know, most parents just encourage. They give positive feedback. When the baby falls, they sometimes pick the baby up and give it a kiss or a hug. They don't give instruction. They don't bring in a coach. They somehow trust that whatever it is that the babies are doing is the right way. Now, we know there are limits. Babies also learn to speak. And if babies don't learn to speak and they don't learn to walk by some limiting factor, an age, so for language, it's around 6 to 8, I think, then they will never learn how to do it. So there is a window of opportunity. But those babies who all learn are scientists. They are experimenting. They are getting up and facing failure. Yes, that's our role model. So what happens? Something goes wrong along the way. That scientific attitude, that comfort with failure, that willingness to get up, that trying continuously. What happens to that? It seems to get lost at some point. And it's hard to say in various environments where things begin to go wrong, where babies are no longer scientists. And when that happens, what we notice is that parents, teachers, mentors begin, instead of encouraging the scientific approach, they begin to tell their babies, children, the answers the right way. Here's how you, whether it has to do with a sport or playing a musical instrument or learning a language or writing or reading, all of a sudden the baby now finds himself or herself in a very different environment where the emphasis now is on the right way to do it, the right answer. And in school, science changes. All of a sudden, it's not about learning and falling down and failure and experimenting. No, it's about learning content, the right answer. And at some point, there'll be an evaluation of performance, an evaluation of content understanding, a quiz, a test. And now the emphasis on sitting, paying attention to, and then regurgitating back information from a parent, a coach, a teacher. And with that comes a fear, the fear of not getting it right, the fear of not measuring up, of disappointing the parents, the coaches, the teachers. And underneath that is the fear of getting it wrong, the fear of failure. Now, I do have a PhD in computer science, so that's how I ended my academic career. And that degree came from Arizona State University. And I had the good fortune of meeting Lawrence Krauss, who's a theoretical physicist. And at one point, he was giving a lecture on the problems in education today. And I was lucky enough to copy down from one of his slides something that really resonated with me. He said, what we do through our whole educational system is give students solvable problems. In other words, a problem that has an answer, a right or a wrong. He said, in the real world, most problems are not solvable. And there are so many factors. You have to think about sociology and technology. It's difficult to implement that in our teaching, but I think we would do a better job and a better service to our students if we tried to teach them to fail more effectively. So in presenting to our babies who become children and then young adults, that there is a right answer, we not only destroy the scientist in them, but we teach them something that isn't true, which is if you do the right thing, then you will get the right answer and you will be successful. And out of that, we create this overwhelming, this debilitating fear that we won't get it right, that we won't find the right answer. And that destroys all of our scientific thinking. No wonder, as soon as we graduate, a lot of us in various technical fields feel we are out of date almost immediately. I can remember going with a friend to a graduating ceremony for a medical school class, and the speaker said, 50% of what we have taught you is wrong. Of course, we don't know which 50%. So now that's for a physician, somebody who's going to go out into the world and try to save lives. Probably equally true, if not more so, for all of us who work in science. So perhaps if we had a shift that would allow more scientific thinking, that would say, instead of just memorizing a list of things, if we talked about solving problems with the idea that there might not be a right solution, there might not be a best solution, it's maybe just a good enough solution that will allow us to learn and to make sure everybody understood that even if you do the best possible flavor of scientific thinking, you rarely ever prove anything. If I am writing about any scientific result, I hesitate to ever use the word prove. I always like to say suggest or consider or what we know at the time. Because even the best, the most intelligent, the most scientific thinkers using the best process can be wrong. There are so many examples, especially now that we're in the middle of a giant validation crisis, that people were not intentionally trying to show something that wasn't true. They did the best they could. The results of science should never be taken to say, this is the end of it. It should be about learning. And if you find along the way that perhaps your result isn't valid anymore, you should be the first to speak up. One of the saddest things that's happened to me lately is realizing that Daniel Kahneman, one of my personal heroes, just passed away in March at the age of 90. He talked a lot about scientific thinking. He talked a lot about thinking. He said, your mind is made up of two pieces, system one and system two. System two is the scientist. It's the one that likes to examine logically. It likes to draw conclusions, that's slow and deliberate, that knows about step by step or baby steps. And Kahneman, until he died, had a reputation for constantly examining his results, constantly seeking feedback, constantly embracing anyone who could point out some area where he might have been wrong, an area for improvement. It's definitely one of my heroes. The other piece of scientific thinking that often gets overlooked is insight. It's hard to put that in a step to say, develop a hypothesis and then have some experiments. And then, oh, by the way, if you have some insight as you're doing those experiments, that's even better. So the classic example of this, of course, is another one of my heroes, Alexander Fleming, who came into his lab in September of 1928. He'd been gone for a month on vacation with his family. And he wasn't a very organized or neat person. And before he left, he just piled up a lot of cultures that he'd been working on and he just moved them to the side. So that when he got back and he started to look at what had been happening during the month while he'd been gone, he wasn't sure, but it looked like maybe some things had gotten messed up or turned upside down, and he did notice that in one of those petri dishes, a particular culture had died. And this particular culture had been contaminated with a fungus that the lab was full of all kinds of growing things. And as he looked at it, he said, "That's funny. I'm not sure that's a step in the scientific method. And I know that when Fleming came to work that day, he didn't say, 'Today I'm going to discover penicillin.' But that's what he did. Just by looking at something that wasn't quite right and having insight, curiosity, realizing his desk was a mess, trying to decide whether he should just toss it all out and start over again. We know that children lose some of that curiosity, insight when they go to school. They pay attention. The best students pay attention. They do what they're told. They get A's on the tests. I'm not saying they all necessarily become robots, but that's what we're rewarded for, is sitting quietly, paying attention. Of course, there are always a few. There are some who remain curious, who remain open, who are not afraid to fail, who learn their entire lives. That's really what we want. We want those babies. We want those babies to say, the wonderful scientists that they started out, falling down. It's okay. Get up. Try again. Baby steps. I know. I hope a lot of you haven't forgotten what it's like to be a baby. I hope you're still curious. I hope you're still open. I hope you're still learning. And I'm hoping that Agile Kata will lead the way. So I'm going to let Joe talk about Agile Kata because I want to learn. I want to get better. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And wow, super interesting. And just when you mentioned this step by step, that is all, there's so many patterns of organizational change in the book you wrote with Marilyn Manson on More Fearless Change, and the earlier one, The Fearless Change. So if you listening to this and you feel like, what is this book about? It's a wonderful pattern catalog for organizational change. And the beauty of these patterns is that they're not standing on its own. They're not just, here's a pattern, do this. Those things connect very well with each other. And you can build a strategy around that. So that is wonderful. I want to connect what Linda, I was just fascinated. Linda, you could have gone on for a much longer time for me personally. Super interesting to hear that. But many of those things you said, I took a couple of notes here in front of me. They resonated very well with me when I got exposed to the world of kata. And the word scientific thinking is obviously intertwined with this. As Linda stated in the beginning, it was scientific thinking, obviously, that we were scientists at some point in our lives when we were in our early days and we're trying things. And that was also videos I saw when children in Greeks and out in the woods, and they flip stones and they look what's underneath. They're curious. They want to find out. They want to explore. And then sometimes we are coming into a business environment where we're being onboarded in our first day of work, where somebody would say, here's your place and these are the procedures within our company. And I'm not saying these things are necessarily negative. However, we are aligning a person from the outside with the procedures that are being expected within an organization. And then we're trying to work within these constraints. We're not really pushing the boundaries. And I think we are approaching an era where we need employees, just as Linda mentioned. We might need people, individuals, to keep pushing the boundaries and say, maybe there is another way. Maybe there's not only two paths, the right and the wrong. Maybe there is another one that can be taken. No, this is just a little funny slide. I came across this picture. I just found it funny and I thought I would share that. It's usually the question about what's the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. It's the half full, half empty kind of thing. But there's also another view, and that's the one from a scientist, looking at the content of a beverage a little bit differently. What is the Agile Kata? And this is what the worlds from Linda and mine have intertwined. The Agile Kata is, from in my description, or some people that would say it's a framework, is it a methodology? And I would say no to those. I would say Agile Kata is a pattern for continuously improving agility. So the mindset of Agile Kata is we're trying to improve agility in various ways on a team or an organizational level. And the Agile Kata is that pattern that makes us behave scientifically. Now, you might find yourselves in a business environment. You would say, I don't know the word scientific thinking. I don't know how that would go along in my organization. I don't know if somebody wants to hear that word. I have experiences using Agile Kata, and I'm not using the word scientific thinking, but behind the scenes, you're still practicing scientific thinking. And that is a key thing for us when applying the Agile Kata. We're saying through a series of baby steps, a series of experiments, we will be exploring a path that is unknown ahead of us, and the pattern will guide us. So, what is the pattern? The pattern is always very easy to explain, harder to do though in practice. But I'll talk a little bit about that. You have seen this, obviously. I make this relatively brief, but then I'll try to connect scientific thinking a little bit closer to those steps. The first one would be for the kata, and this was all extracted and first written down by Mike Rother in the book Toyota Kata. That book is really focused on manufacturing. He extracted that kind of scientific thinking and the approach they're taking within Toyota, and he described it as Toyota Kata. The word kata is not, as far as I know, as I don't work for Toyota, is not being used at Toyota itself. It's just like the thinking process, and it aligns with scientific thinking. So the first step is really to find out, where is this journey going to go? What is the direction? What is the challenge? What is we're trying to solve? We're not trying to match a certain behavior. We're trying to figure out, what is the challenge ahead of us? We're trying to address. Where do we want to go? So that step is far out. So that blue arrow you see on that slide right now is a directional path. So we're going far into the future. That's why one is far out on the top right corner. So this might be 6, 9 months out, could be 3 months out. There's really no timeline to it you're planning for, but shouldn't be very far out. It should be something which is like, horizon we can still think of. Otherwise, we would break it down. So it's not the North Star. It's usually something being broken down. So if you are in a process of an agile transformation, number one would not necessarily be, I want to become an agile organization. That would be too big, and this would be an ongoing activity. So we would break these kind of things down until we have a challenge. Now, here's the interesting piece in the kata sequence for me personally. And that was a big aha moment for me, that before we actually have this direction we want to go, there's a lot of organizations would say, we know our goal, we know our strategy, let's go. And the Agile Kata, actually, scientific thinking says, hey, that's great that you know where you want to go, but why don't we step first back and actually look at our current condition and our current situation? Where are we right now? How big is the gap of where we are right now to where we would like to go? A lot of teams and organizations I have worked with in an Agile context would just jump in and say, oh, we need this, we need this, we need this, without actually looking at data, right? Or whatever you have, observations where we have evidence of where we currently are. So step 2 is a fundamentally interesting step in this pattern to identify where we currently are. And now comes Linda's baby step, right? We're actually now saying, we know where we eventually, our direction. And by the way, number 1 might also shift a little bit over time, right? So it's not a straight line here necessarily, but we know where we want to go. We know where we currently are. And step three is really helping us to plan for these kind of baby steps ahead of us. Now, this is very different to what you might be exposed to by processes of Scrum. This is not a time box. This is not a time window. And that is also fits very well with what Linda just said is we're experimenting, right? We're not saying in the next 2 weeks we want to learn to walk, right? Or we want to make improvements on walking and then putting a timeline to it. We're just trying to get up and trying to make some moves. And this might happen in 2 days. This might happen in 5 days. This might happen in 3 weeks, right? Whatever, whenever that moment is right, whenever that experiment is completed. So the target condition is a condition. It's not a plan. We're just saying here's the current condition. What's our next target? What is it we're trying to achieve? And now comes this beautiful part in between, that's step four, that says, what can we do? What kind of experiments can we take to make that step from two to three? And we call that experimentation towards the target condition. So by having these two kind of conditions, we can plan experiments. Now comes this moment of I try something and I fall. And that's why you see that bumpy road in the background, right? So this is very bumpy. Your experiment might not work out as intended. You might not achieve the target condition with the experiment where you took. Try another experiment. And that's why you see a kind of rotation around that element that says four on it, because that is an iterative kind of process until you reach the next target condition. So that is fundamentally speaking a very basic pattern for scientific thinking. You have your direction, you know where you are, you know what is your next small step you can take, and then you're organizing and planning your experiments. Obviously, there is a lot to it. Obviously, I'm simplifying this here right now to execute and facilitate these kind of things. But that is the thinking process that establishes a different way of thinking in organizations. When we saw that out of the lean movement came Kata in 2009, we built that bridge to the agile communities and said, hold on one second, the agile manifesto, there's four value statements and working software over comprehensive documentation as an example. There's this word over in between. It doesn't say you're agile or not. The word over makes it soft. You say there's a position to take. We can constantly push the boundaries towards more agility because you can't really go to an organization and say like, we are agile or not. Even organizations that work in agile ways still have room to push the boundaries towards more agility. And I think with the current trends we see in the business world, that will be much, much needed at this point to actually continue to push agility towards more and more to the left and adapt over time. So this is an ongoing kind of journey. So the Agile Kata is this process of thinking that it needs to be established. And for some reason, we have lost that kind of thinking over time when we went to school, right? And we unlearned these kind of things. And there are actually much needed skills in the business world. So navigating through this pattern, we are establishing over time an approach to scientific thinking as well as continuous improvement. So an agile transformation, when you hear that in your organization has been completed or is over, that wouldn't really be the case with the Agile Kata. You can certainly stop within Agile Kata, but that would mean that you stop improving. And I don't think that would be in the interest. It establishes a new pattern of thinking and working. And it also creates a vocabulary among everybody in the organization. So once you start using Agile Kata, somebody might say, what's your current condition? Or what's your next target condition? So people will start using this vocabulary and becomes this new part of communicating within an organization. So it's really powerful. And then you see between three and one, I just added another couple of little things. Is obviously once we have achieved the next target condition, we would plan our next target condition, and so on. Now that is the kind of dynamic we like in organizations. We say, what's the target condition and how can we get there as quick as possible with experiments, but also in a solid quality for whatever the context of your work is. And once we have achieved that, we move on with the next target conditions. We're not planning in these 2 week or 3 week or 4 week intervals. We're planning we're looking at the condition and we're planning the experiments. So it is creates creativity within the team. It fosters self-organization around these experiments and so on. Now, you might look at these 4 steps right now and say, that's a lot of planning. Step 1 needs to be planned. Step 2 requires planning. Step 3 requires planning. And then there's only step 4 where we're actually experimenting. That's true from a planning perspective. If you just look at the time though, the time you're spending in step 1, 2, and 3 versus 4, 4 is the longest piece of all of those. So you will feel when you're doing Agile Kata, it feels like that you're spending the most time in step 4. It's a very hands-on, very practical kind of approach. So when we hear like scientific thinking and you feel like, oh, that sounds theoretical, the opposite is the case, right? It's just this thinking process that helps us to get to work and to validate our results. Now, why is it called Agile Kata? Because we strongly believe that there needs to be some form of guidance around this process to support agility. So, for example, coaching, right? So, would it be helpful in our business world to have somebody go alongside with us? If we want to create an environment, and you see here on the left side a circle of people of known tools to many agilists out there. Inclusion of liberating structures, open space, mob programming, pair programming. We want automation. We want agile leadership. We want to measure value as our progress. So we want to surround the scientific thinking with existing agile ways of working and really make sure that the culture is not introduced as a result of the transformation, but already during the transformation, because the transformation is ongoing. So we strongly believe that leadership, teams, and everyone within the organization needs to not only adapt to scientific thinking, but also to the way of how we conduct these things. Now, what's interesting, what Linda said earlier was she mentioned the fear of doing it wrong. And I wrote this down because I feel like there's fundamentally when we see agile organization, especially in economic difficult times, when people are being asked, so what should we do here? What should we do there? What's your expertise on this? We often see that we seek safety in certain frameworks and methodologies, right? We believe that a existing framework that has thought through start to end processes will guide us, whereas in reality, that might A, not fit the situation, nor does it necessarily bring out the creativity we would like to see. So with Agile Kata, you can build products. With Agile Kata, you can build things as a team. The Agile Kata can help the leadership to introduce scientific thinking in an organization. With the Agile Kata, you can steer, rejuvenate, even new refreshing kind of restart of your agile transformation if you already in full swing. It could also be used as a starting point of exactly that. Just today, I talked to somebody who wanted to introduce OKRs into their organization. Here we go. Agile Kata is the means to do that, right? It would be a great way, stepwise, to introduce a new idea into an organization. It is a different way. It supports the baby steps. And in the agile world, we're very often inclined to use the word baby steps. Let's take one step at a time. We're using baby steps. And that's really what this is. Very short steps between steps 2 and 3 in our kata. So interesting about the Agile Kata, just a couple of bullet points here, is really questions you want to ask when you work with kata in general is, how do you know that? So questions like that is like when you will in your day-to-day encounters with peers or with others in your organization or stakeholders, and you hear statements, and how do we know? How do we know that this is the fact? Do we have data to support it? Do we have evidence of any kind that makes us believe that this is really where we are? Are there any kind of alternatives we can have? Can we run and possibly another experiment? Even if the first experiment was already successful, in our words, we say, maybe there is another path. Should we explore that and see what it sounds or is more promising? We would identify easily with scientific thinking within an organization what is the progress towards our goal, because with Agile Kata, something we didn't have the time to cover here today, that's for another one, everything is pretty much documented, the experiments, the outcome of the experiments, what obstacles we're facing, etc. So we have a very good, transparent insight into how we're progressing. Crowdsourcing is very well supported. There's really no team structure. The teams might actually be more fluid. And you could have a static team for sure. You could work as a very similar to a Scrum team, but it's not required. You can, for experiments, actually bring a different group of people together. How do we communicate? I just mentioned like the vocabulary as we have and what kind of data you collect. And hopefully that would be in the agile spirit connected to value and how we measure value. Now, Agile Kata is the starting point, not the end result. If somebody looks at this and says, what's the big deal about these 4 steps, right? The 4 steps is just to get somebody practicing scientific thinking. Over time, it is expected here in my second bullet point that somebody would adjust this behavior over time. I would say start practicing kata and agile kata as it is in the beginning with, again, more stuff we haven't had a chance to cover. However, the goal eventually is that you will, similar to your organizational process, not saying deviate from those steps, but possibly build another step or have something else, right, that supports the way of how you work. That would be actually intentional. So this is not like process conformity. It's a starting point for everyone to get started with scientific thinking. And that is the routine that can help you with that. Deliberately practicing it, right? That is relates very well to sports, right? Where you continuously reiterating, re-practicing routines, even though you have already practiced them many times before. So even the most professional tennis players, when they come on the court, they're just going to warm up a little bit and they hit some balls and they continuously re-practice what they already, you would think, know already to perfection. But that is just like to reinforce. And we need the same thing in scientific thinking. And the Agile Kata is exactly that kind of behavior to continuously reinforce that behavior. And that makes it more challenging in organizations to stick as a new way. You cannot just change from one day to another. It takes time. And the Agile Kata is that routine to manifest that in our brains. So practicing it is key because that's really how we as humans learn, not by just listening, but also practicing it. So it's a great tool. And I wanted to share that with you. And I obviously wanted to connect it a little bit to scientific thinking. So the Agile Kata is a tool to get you to that and to reinforce a different way of thinking and rethinking what you're currently doing at work.